Hello and welcome to the Smarter Food Supply Chain webinar series. I'm Mike Ellen and I serve AIM as their member engagement manager. AIM North America is an alliance enabling the cooperation, development, and standardization of AIDC technologies. From barcodes to RFID to IoT, AIM North America is your advocate. Any organization with an interest in data collection is a beneficiary of these efforts. Membership provides an opportunity to influence the direction of the industry, develop policies and standards, access market reports, and engage new partners. Today, I'm here with Felix Amiri. Felix is the current Food Sector Chair, Global Coalition for Sustained Excellence in Food and Health Protection, and Technical Director at APHIS, providing consulting services to food companies. Felix is a key contributor to the safety, security, and quality assurance concept. Felix has an in-depth knowledge of food safety and quality management systems, and he is very familiar with international standards and food safety certification schemes. Felix will be discussing today the important role of regulations around the world in the smarter food safety era. Welcome, Felix.
Well, thank you, Michael, for inviting me to this presentation. I know it's going to be a short presentation of the important role of regulations around the world in the smarter food safety era. This is being led by Frank Yiannas of the FDA in the US, and I think it's going to be a good thing for the world. So again, thank you for everyone who is attending this webinar. Hopefully, we'll be able to cover some points that would inspire you in this area of work. As Michael said, I am the current chair, the food sector chair for the Global Coalition for Sustained Excellence in Food and Health Protection, also technical director at APHIS. After the webinar, if you have any questions, you can send those to me through email. I will provide my brief email contact for you to use for that purpose. So we just go ahead and launch into our topic here. A quick introduction. Food law and regulations are not always center stage. And what I mean by that is it's one of the things that's relegated, or one of the things that are relegated to the back burner in terms of daily operations and daily interests and pursuits. However, it's beginning to be more apparent now that regulations play a key role from different perspectives. So I think the industry should be moving regulations to the center stage, and because that's where they're going to be in the next little while, especially with the new era, food safety, smarter food safety era. Now, everyone is affected by food regulations, as we all know, whether we are directly in contact with regulators or not. They protect us and as consumers and the public in general. And so regulations are very important, and food regulations, just because it affects everyone, should be of interest to all of us. Smarter food safety era and the necessity of meeting regulations is clear, as a clear, I would say, a thing that will become clearer and clearer to those in the industry because of new technologies and what those are contributing to food safety in the industry today. With the advent of Internet of Things and the artificial intelligence that could facilitate a lot of activities around food safety management and food safety regulation, things are ramping up for greater engagement, which will be good for the industry. Of course, the whole enforcement strategies is an area that's ever expanding. Recently, Frank Yiannas of the FDA announced the collaboration that's happening between the Center for Disease Control and United States Department of Agriculture, USDA. And of course, this is the kind of collaboration that's going to be happening, not just within the US, but internationally. And again, along the same lines, Frank Yiannas was just last week meeting with the Canadian Food Inspection Agency and posted a little introduction on LinkedIn about that, to which I responded, of course, that it's a good thing. that international agencies are beginning to collaborate in this area. And this is going to be what this will mean. The implication is that food companies around the world will be subjected to the same kind of things that Frank Yanis is pushing, which is an expanded enforcement, as well as using technology to drive regulation and expecting food operations to meet regulations. Of course, we will touch on some of those points later on. I'll cover during this webinar the functional facts about regulations, the readiness and resources that food operations and associated organizations should have, and I'll touch a bit on the compliance and commitment planning that should help operations and organizations to meet the expected regulations or the enforced regulations. So bear with me, and we'll go through some of these foundational facts. They may be a bit technical, but it's important to know what makes a regulation and the direction that the regulations are headed around the world because of the particularly the influence of the what you might say the developed countries that are beginning to work together in some of these areas. They've always worked together. There has been acceptance of each country's regulations in other countries where trade happens, but I think with the new technologies and the kind of things that are being introduced into the market, there will be greater collaborations. We've seen from the example of meeting with CFI, Australia, Europe, and so on that FDA is pushing. So quickly, regulations are not optional consideration. Everybody knows that now. They're the law. And hopefully I'll be able to mention a bit about what is the relationship between the law itself and the regulation, but also just to touch the fact that regulations, since they're based on the law law is designed to protect the public, and there's a public protection function of regulations everywhere. It's the same, no matter which country we're talking about or the jurisdiction that is in focus. So the US, Canada, and Europe, Australia, Japan, China, everywhere, the interest is to protect the public. That's what regulations do. And there are three main points of protection that regulations and the laws generally focus on, which is public health. In the case of food safety and health products, it's public health and safety, public need, and public interest. Regulators are moving from being highly prescriptive to becoming preventive. This means that whereas the rules were so specific, you shall do this or do that, or shall not do this or do that, now they're expecting operations that must meet these regulations to determine what they need to do in order to safeguard the public from those three aspects that we just mentioned. So, and regulators are holding operations accountable and sometimes liable for not taking or exercising due diligence. So they are moving to being preventive to ensure that any undesirable situations do not occur due to the operations and activities of food organizations. And so it's basically taking along the same lines of the scientific suggestion of things like HACCP, as a hazard analysis and critical control point. Preventive methodologies are now extending that to regulations because the industry has that science or that knowledge. The regulators are expecting food organizations to implement or adopt those strategies or systems that actually prevent bad circumstances. Also, regulations are becoming more outcome-based. What this means is that the outcome, which is the expectation, the public protection, the public safety, public need, and public interest the results of activities is now the focus of regulators. So when things like, say, the romaine lettuce issue that has been tormenting the US and Canada, when things like that come up, regulators are beginning to hold the operations accountable for um, what they're doing and the results of what they're doing to protect the public. So um, it's not so much the inspector coming to see that you meet the letter of the law according to what is spelled out in the regulations, but what is that doing? What is it accomplishing? Is the product safe because of what you've done? And that's the kind of outcome that regulations are beginning, or regulators are beginning to expect. And if the outcome is not acceptable, it would not matter if you meet the stated rule. You still have a problem and still held liable for not exercising enough due diligence to protect the public. Now, regulations often have unwritten but important expectations that are in the regulations. Sometimes if you do not read the regulations, read between the lines, there are things that the regulation expects you to meet that you may not meet. So it is important to understand the techniques for interpreting the regulations in ways that allow you to meet the unwritten rules, so to speak, because whether or not you're aware of it, you will still be held accountable for meeting what the regulations expect. And so because of that, I break down the regulatory clause. What is a regulatory clause? Any regulation in the world that you examine, you'll find that they will take you through the main regulation to sections and parts, and all of those categorization will have statements of things that you must do. And so this is broken down in the following way. You will have mandatory elements, or what I call mandatory. Those are the things that you must do or must not do. And you will have exceptions. Sometimes the regulations do understand that, the regulators do understand that food operations may not be set up to be able to meet certain aspects, or they don't even need to meet certain aspects of the regulations, because they're generally they're general covers. The regulations cover everything, and not every operation does everything. So there are situations where there are exemptions and exceptions that are granted to operations, but the operator must still prove the need for such exceptions or exemptions. Of course, the regulations will also have optional things, things like if say for a food regulation that says a food facility shall have hand washing provisions, the hand washing provision must be present. That is a mandatory element. However, the number of the hand washing stations may vary depending on the size of the operation. That would be an example of an optional thing. So the fact that you must have hand washing stations is mandatory, but the number you have is optional. And then of course there are guidelines, things that the regulations themselves will provide to guide operations in terms of what they can do to meet the regulations, what the regulations actually expect. Those things are provided as guidelines, which are really suggestions. And the current advent of food regulations in Canada and the US are beginning to adopt these guidelines as part of the regulation. So if you are working with regulations these days in North America, you want to pay attention to those guidelines that are becoming the same as the regulations. In other words, they're given the same force of law as the regulations. In Canada, those guidelines are described as documents incorporated by reference, which means that there were existing guidelines. Now in the regulations, if they refer to such guidelines, they become part of the regulations, and those who must meet the regulations should be aware of those type of connections between the guidelines and the regulations. So guidelines have become more forceful or have gained more regulatory authority than they were before because of the term guide, which suggests it's up to you to take it, but that's not the case for all of them these days. And there are also references. These are key aspects of regulatory clause. The reason they're important is because sometimes the references are made to other regulations or other parts of the law that operators must be aware of in order to meet the entire intent of the law. And so they're very important to pay attention to those cross-references. Typically they're to other parts of the same regulation or to other regulations that are connected. Now, I mentioned that the focus of new regulations is preventive, and they are also risk-based. In other words, they are consider the risk level of the operation of the products, of the outputs from operations. And as such, they are subject to some of the scientific systems that are out there, things like HACCP. And in the case of the US, they have introduced the hazard analysis and risk preventive control, risk-based preventive control. So HACCP has been changed to HARP-C for the US. In Canada, it's still the same idea, but they're simply calling it the preventive control plan. And they're all the same. They expect operations to do a thorough hazard analysis based on risk and taking the proper steps to control those risks. And I mentioned also that they're outcome-based, focusing on results of following the rules and allowing greater flexibility and room for innovative and effective approaches to food safety. In other words, if you can prove that your actions, your activities or processes are achieving the outcome, which is the outcome that protects the public according to those three elements that were mentioned, then you can make a case for what you're doing as meeting the regulation. Otherwise, on the other hand, you'll be held liable if your outcome does not meet the regulation, even if everything you did was exactly according to what the regulations stated. But your product, your outcome is still creating problem or presenting risk to the consumer. This is a direction that things are going. It places more onus on the operator to make sure that their products, their outputs, have those elements. The public is protected and their needs are met. Again, it's system-based, and part of this is the idea that the solutions, the entire system, as the systems are supposed to work together to provide the solutions. So operations will need to adopt systematic approach, a holistic approach that addresses all of the issues or potential hazards or potential risks that their operation pose, and address all of those risks in ways that regulations are met. Expectations go beyond the rules in most regulations. And so there will be statements like, and anything else that the operator must do. In other words, the rules will be stated, and then a general statement so that expands the scope to what else you must do are included in the regulations. This is the kind of language that is beginning to go into regulations, and that creates the need for operations to be very attentive and to seek ways of actually understanding their operation and the risks involved, and with a never-ending continuous improvement approach and continuous research to make sure that all risks are addressed, existing risks, new risks, anything, new developments that could create problem with their operations and products, they need to be attentive to those and pursue research that allows them to um, make sure that they meet the requirements, the expectations of regulations, which is to protect the public. It's becoming more and more intensive, you might say, not as simply a simple inspector and operator interaction anymore. Um, you are expected to go beyond the rules. There's also in the current evolution of regulations, the expansion of authorities. For example, in the US and Canada, and some other parts of the world also, the inspector now, or the regulator can now have the authority to inspect records, your data, your information that you're gathering in your operation are by law expected to be available to the inspectors. They have authority to enter premises at any time, whereas previously they would have to seek permission. Now they have been granted the powers to enter premises. They have also been granted the powers to seize goods, which is really a very, um, I would say, effective way of making sure that all records, the premises and goods are in order according to the regulations, and again with the extended expectations of things that may not be specifically stated in the rules. I'm looking at the example of the Safe Food for Canadian regulations, specifically with this webinar, and the Food Safety Modernization Act, because these are two examples that the rest of the world basically have followed, perhaps not directly with the same content, but the ideas are the ideas are permeating the world in terms of what the regulations or the directions that they're going. There are three areas of food safety regulation focused in the Safe Food for Canadian regulations. That's what SFCR stand for, Safe Food for Canadian regulations. The three areas include the licensing, which means that operations within Canada are expected to register with the agency that is, and the agency here is the Canadian Food Inspection Agency. All food operations, especially when they're exporting out of province. So whether out of the country or out of individual provinces, they're expected, it's mandatory for food operations in those kind of operations to license if they're trading outside of province. And also traceability has become regulated, a mandatory thing because of the associations with traceability. It's not just for recall of bad product, but traceability is also very essential for where claims are made. If you say organic, then only organic ingredients should go into the product. Or if you say GMO free, as the European organization or associations or regulations are beginning to respect, and any of those claims, traceability is important to make sure that other ingredients that do not meet those claims go into the product. And so traceability is expanded and technology is being developed, or actually has existed for good traceability. And now it's in the law in Canada and the US anyway, that operations must ensure good traceability of their product with good records about the sources or origin of ingredients and so forth, and where the end products go. Preventive controls and preventive control plans are also a big part in the Safe Food Canadian regulations. This is really HACCP, just a different term. And the idea is to make sure that it's no longer focused on some critical control points, but all of those critical control points and other preventive controls that must be in place are in place. And so the general description of preventive controls has taken over from the critical control point. And because the industry had the idea that if it's critical control points, it requires more attention than if it's just a prerequisite program. But the preventive controls idea in the regulations are now beginning to say even those prerequisite program controls are essential, and so they must be properly pursued as if they were critical control points, and that's the idea. The same thing is seen in the Food Safety Modernization Act by the FDA, and the USDA has, although it's not part of the FSMA, they do have similar expectations. So all of the laws, regulations, no matter the agency, they have these expectations that there would be preventive controls. FSMA has just highlighted that, and Safe Food for Canadian regulations also has highlighted that preventive controls expectations. Now, all regulations, inspection, which is the idea behind the licensing in Canada, um, in the FSMA, the inspection and compliance is what takes place of the licensing also, because operations have to register with FDA or USDA, depending on their commodity or their product. And this is to make the agency know who is doing what where, and it's essential for regulation to be enforced. The Food Safety Modernization Act also focuses on imported food, and it has the rule for a foreign supplier verification program that all foreign suppliers, all importers into the U.S. must ensure that their suppliers are actually verified, and the systems for doing that are spelled out in that foreign supplier verification program. Also, the FDA's FSMA has the has incorporated the response portion or consideration in the Food Safety Modernization Act. It is with respect to recalls, to ensure that recalls are a response to a situation of outbreak is quick, to bring products back and safeguard the public against further risk that is posed by a product that has failed in terms of outbreaks. And so the response element has been intensified or extended, better defined within the new Food Safety Modernization Act of the US FDA. Also, the enhanced partnership consideration, which also is not, although it's not spelled out in the Safe Food for Canadian regulations, there are several activities that show the partnership that industry and regulators are supposed to have. So this is happening already. As we can see from Frankie Anna's meeting with the USDA, CDC, that's the Center for Diseases Control, Centers for Disease Control rather in the US, the collaboration with the agencies and industry is part of the partnerships that these new regulations are beginning to enforce. And so it's important that industry contribute to regulations rather than the previous arrangement where there's an antagonistic relationship. Industry doesn't want regulators to come, and regulators insist on coming to industry in that. But this time, with the partnership, enhanced partnerships, it's expected that there'll be more collaborative attention to the things that need to be done to protect the public. Now, for all regulations, labeling laws are essential, are the central where activities happen most frequently, because regulators always want to be sure that the communication to the public is clear in the product. So where claims are made, nutritional content declarations, weights and measures, all of those things that the labels are supposed to make known to consumers, origins or country of origins, and all of those things are monitored closely and frequently, because that's where things tend to fall aside sometimes, and the regulators are aware of that. So labeling is a big thing. It's an area of high activity in most regulations around the world. And this is an area that operations need to pay close attention to and make sure that there's integrity in the labels and accuracy as well. Now, I mentioned that I was going to quickly state the relationship between the law and the regulation. It's really very simple. And I'll use examples. In Canada, the laws are described as the acts. So you'll have food safety, say, for example, Food and Drug uh, Act or um, Processed Product Act. There would be a regulation that actually interprets that act. So where you have Food and Drugs regulation, where you have Food and Drugs Act, you would have Food and Drug regulations. And in the US, it's the separation is the US Code and the Code of Federal Regulations. So the US Code is the law, and the Code of Federal Regulations are those specifics that define that law. And so these are just a very close relation. Some people are confused about what should we follow, the act or the regulations. Well, it's easy. The regulations is what you work with because they interpret the act or the law. And if you start working there and you want to understand a bit more, then you can go to the act document to examine why the regulations are stating what they are stating. And so that's the simple question. Again, I said, if you have any questions after we've completed this webinar, you can feel free to contact me. I'll give you my contact information. Operations need to be ready to meet the laws. And thankfully, the agencies are providing resources for that to happen. So I would strongly suggest that you use available support and provisions for the regulatory agencies and use the guidance documents that are provided. And some of these, as I mentioned, are becoming part of the regulations as well. The CFIA, FDA, USDA, and other regulatory agencies have the email subscription provisions that could help operations to be current with what is happening. So you can subscribe to these and get updates as to what's happening. And I've provided some links here. The Canadian updates is the listserv. FDA has the link there. If you're able to either copy that link and search for that information. If the link is broken, just do your search engine and say FDA updates or USDA updates or Canadian Food Inspection updates. You should be able to get the same links. Compliance planning and commitment. This is an area that I would say I strongly recommend that it's not just wait for the inspector to come, but you actually have to deliberately plan to comply. And that planning needs to be supported by the commitment of the organization to make sure that the regulations are met and beyond, because essentially your output is your interest. You want your customer to keep coming back, and you want your output to have to meet the needs that they have or pose no risk to them. So it's important to plan the compliance and commitment. The regulations, as we know, are becoming more and more mandatory, and so priority should be given to them. There are strategic ways of meeting regulations and actually going beyond regulations, and some of those are beginning to be developed. I have worked with some of my colleagues in GCSE and come up with the what we call the NODE, that's Nucleus of Dominant Effect approach, for addressing regulations, especially for organizations that are working with so many regulations at the same time. They need such an approach of efficiency building in terms of meeting regulations that apply to their operations. So those are some of the strategies. Now, of course, independent strategies could be developed, but the idea is to know the regulations, first of all, and to see how you could meet several using the same approach to developing your processes, your products, processes, and delivery systems. A quick wrap up. Sorry I'm taking so much time, but I think it's important to look at some of these things. And of course, even then, we don't have enough time to look at them in detail. But just to quickly wrap up here, regulations are relevant, as we know. They protect all of us. And they give the government agencies the opportunity to do their job well. They spell out things so that there's understanding. And with the era of collaboration and the era of smarter food safety systems, um, the relevance of regulations becoming more and more a thing of common knowledge. And we need to take advantage of the systems that are available, technological systems that are provided by the different agent operations and suppliers and solution providers. Regulatory relationship, the law with the public, I did mention, um, is the fact that the law is the basis for the regulation. The law meaning that violation may incur liabilities, legal liabilities, or even fines. And so regulations are part of the law. And of course, the public interest is their protection, their interest and their needs protected by regulations. The reach of regulations is expanding. And so previously, some operations were not even on the radar for some agencies, but now, because of the expanded licensing approach, as well as the collaboration between agencies and between countries, the reach of regulations is expanding, and everyone will be what you might say covered by regulations and monitored. So this is something we need to be aware of in the industry in order to work more collaboratively with the regulators and the government. Compliance and commitment planning needs to be done strategically. Operations need to understand that they're not just going to wait for inspectors to come, but to be ready for the inspectors to come. And the resources are available through the agencies themselves, and of course through other academic avenues, learning about regulations and the international regulations, as well as other sources of information that could be searched to find how to plan for meeting regulations. There's always the need to regularly review regulations because they're always changing. And so operations should be aware of that, put that as part of the plan to regularly review, register or enlist with the updates, and keep up to date with what is coming up in the regulations. And most importantly, get help where you can from the regulators themselves, from academic institutions that have programs in the food law programs and food regulation programs. Help is available. Technological solution providers also have systems for getting into the smarter food approach. And this is an area of increased activity, I would say. So I wish you all the best in your pursuit, your commitment to meeting regulations. And as I said, I am actually available for further questions. And for those who may be interested, I am scheduled to speak on a related topic at an upcoming food industry event. This is in Cambridge, Ontario, Canada, at the end of April. And one of the topics is what I mentioned earlier, application of the node strategy in meeting local and international regulations. So that's my presentation for today. Hopefully you've been able to gather some points, but it's recorded and you can replay it. And if you have a point that I didn't quite explain as clearly, feel free to give me, send me an email. There's my email address, felix@afisservices.com. And thank you very much for your time. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Felix, for your time and knowledge. And before we go, just a reminder that we will be back on February 26th with another webinar for the Food Supply Chain webinar series. Thanks and have a great day.